All right, so welcome to another deep dive with yours truly. Today, we're going to be taking a look at spiritual teachings and groups,
Okay.
but specifically the kind that start with, the best intentions, like most things do.
Right.
But maybe over time, things go a little sideways.
Hmm.
And, how do we spot that? And what are the signs? And, what are we looking for
Hmm.
to figure that out? So we've got this stack of research on cults, what they call deteriorated spiritual systems.
Right?
We've got some online discussions and even some personal stories,
Ah,
all centered around a specific group and its leader.
interesting.
So think of this deep dive as your toolkit
Yep.
to spot those red flags
Yeah.
and to figure out if a group is on the level or not.
You know, I think it is interesting because a lot of times when we think about spiritual teachings,
Mm.
we think about them as these eternal, unchanging truths.
Right.
But, they can actually go through a process of
Right.
what some scholars call fossilization.
Fossilization, interesting.
Yeah, think about it like this. You have a beautiful flower, and you press it between the pages of a book.
Oh,
It's going to keep its shape,
right.
but it loses, all of its vibrancy and life.
So you're saying the original spark, like the real heart of the teaching, ends up getting kind of buried
Yeah.
under all of these like rituals and dogma.
Yeah, like layers and layers of stuff.
So at that point, does the teaching itself become harmful?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
One of our sources actually makes a distinction between a teaching that is deteriorated versus a teaching that is inherently destructive.
Gotcha.
So like a deteriorated system, it might still contain valuable insights.
Right.
But the emphasis is shifted from understanding to just rigid observance.
Hmm.
So now the practice becomes more about following the rules than actually like experiencing the deeper meaning.
I can see where the problems would arise because if it's all about like outward appearances
Yes.
and following the letter of the law, you could have people who are acting very spiritual, on the surface,
Yeah, for sure.
but not really embodying those qualities in their daily life,
Right.
which would, I guess, create a kind of hypocrisy.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, and that's actually a very common red flag to watch out for.
Okay.
One of the sources uses an example, and they talk about traditional teachings that encourage things like giving up material possessions or avoiding pride,
Right.
which on the surface, yeah, those are great qualities to cultivate,
Right.
but it's not the end goal in itself.
Right. It's supposed to help us grow spiritually.
Exactly.
And not just to make us look good.
Right.
So how do we apply these ideas to like a real world situation?
Well, that's a great question. Why don't we dive into this case study
Okay.
about the Science of Identity Foundation,
Okay.
led by Chris Butler,
All right.
who also goes by Jagad Guru Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa.
Wow. That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, yeah.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that what we are discussing are allegations based on the information that we have.
Of course.
And we are not here to pass judgment.
Right. But the allegations are pretty serious.
They are serious.
You've got cult-like behavior, financial irregularities,
Mhm.
accusations of hypocrisy, and even more troubling things. So I'm really curious to see how those concepts of fossilization
Yeah,
and mistaking outward behavior for genuine spirituality
right.
play out in this specific case.
Yeah, well, we can already see this fossilization process in how followers talk about Butler.
Okay.
In some of the online discussions, he's quoted almost like scripture.
Really?
Yeah, with very little critical analysis or questioning of his authority.
So it's not just about the teachings themselves becoming rigid, but it's also about how the leader is perceived
Yes.
and the power dynamic that creates,
Exactly.
which makes sense.
And that dynamic becomes especially dangerous when you combine it with the potential for manipulation.
Right.
And one of our sources, a document called databases001vol.pdf, actually lists hundreds of names of alleged cult members.
Wow.
And it even details their financial contributions to political campaigns.
Oh, wow.
So it suggests a possible link between, spiritual devotion
Yeah.
and financial or political influence.
Yeah, because if you're devoted to a person and they tell you to do something,
Right.
you're probably going to do it,
Yes.
regardless of what it is.
Yeah,
And we also have these personal stories,
we do.
right? Like the one about Kasia
Yeah.
in Iowa Chaitanya Mission Polish 00165.pdf. And it's heartbreaking to read about her becoming increasingly isolated from her family,
Right.
completely devoted to the group,
Yeah.
and then tragically taking her own life.
Yeah, and her story raises so many questions about the potential for harm when a group's influence becomes all-encompassing.
Right.
And Even if her, involvement with the group wasn't the direct cause of her death,
Sure.
it really underscores the need for critical thinking and maintaining healthy boundaries.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems like the sources paint a pretty disturbing picture of the group's dynamics.
Yeah.
We also have Facebook posts from this former member, Daruk Frankowski, that criticize the group and Butler's authority.
Frankowski's posts are really interesting because they offer firsthand perspective from someone who was once deeply involved.
Right.
And he raises concerns about the group's finances, the treatment of members, and Butler's seemingly unquestioned authority.
We also have two pieces from Jasper Leonard.
Okay.
Lower Than Strawn in the Street and the Guru's Lotus Feedback B. Jasper Leonard. Feb 2025, medium.pdf.
Wow.
And The Bird Santa Beast Off the Cult by Jasper Leonard Jan 2025, medium.pdf,
Gotcha.
which share his personal observations about Butler.
Okay.
One quote that really struck me was about Butler being extremely germophobic,
Oh, really?
but then also saying that, quote, he's the most toxic thing in his own home and in the lives of his followers.
Wow. Yeah.
It makes you wonder if there's a disconnect between his outward image and the reality of his behavior.
Yeah, and that perceived disconnect is something we see in a lot of groups.
Okay.
Where leaders are placed on a pedestal.
Right.
There's this tendency to overlook or rationalize behaviors that don't align with their idealized image.
And that's why it's so crucial to pay attention to those red flags, right? To question what we see, what we hear, even when it comes from someone that we might admire or respect.
Exactly.
And speaking of red flags, there's this quote from Butler himself.
Oh, okay.
In Analyza Manipulacci Surrender.pdf that I found really concerning.
What's that?
He tells his followers that what they really need to do is, quote, focus your energy on self-criticism, your own imperfections, not to try to change them with your own strength or anything.
Oh.
And he goes on to say that this self-abasement is the path to experiencing love for Krishna.
I mean, that's intense.
It's intense. And I can see how that kind of language could be very powerful,
Right.
especially for people who might be struggling with self-doubt or low self-esteem.
Absolutely. It creates a dynamic where followers become dependent on the leader for validation.
Right.
So instead of empowering them to grow and develop their own sense of self-worth,
Right.
it encourages them to relinquish their agency and submit to the leader's authority.
It seems like we're starting to see some clear patterns here.
Yeah.
You've got the fossilization of teachings, the over-veneration of the leader,
Right.
and the emphasis on external behavior over genuine inner transformation.
Right.
It's making me wonder, what makes people vulnerable to this kind of manipulation in the first place?
That's a great question.
And
luckily, we have some insights from our next source,
okay.
traumabusecults.pdf,
Okay.
which actually goes into the psychology of spiritual abuse and cult dynamics.
Great.
One of the key takeaways is this idea of the self-object.
Okay, what is a self-object?
So think of it this way. As humans, we all need other people to help us develop a sense of self and to meet our emotional needs.
Right, so like parents, mentors,
Yes.
close friends,
Exactly.
people we trust, people we look up to.
Right. People who help us feel seen, understood, and valued.
Makes sense.
But what's fascinating is, according to this source, charismatic leaders can exploit those very needs for power and control.
So someone who's had, like, a difficult childhood, maybe they're feeling lost and alone.
Yeah.
They might be especially susceptible to a leader who promises to fulfill those unmet needs.
Absolutely.
So they're almost offering like a fast track
Yes.
to feeling whole and complete.
Right.
But I have a feeling it doesn't quite work out that way.
Unfortunately, no.
Right.
It doesn't. And this source explains how that dynamic can lead to a dangerous cycle of dependence,
Okay.
where followers become increasingly isolated from their support networks outside of the group, and they start to rely solely on the leader for approval and guidance.
And they start to see the leader as like an idealized parent figure.
Exactly.
Who can protect them from pain, give them unconditional love and acceptance.
Right, exactly.
And I'm seeing how this all connects back to Butler and the allegations against him.
Okay.
If followers come to see him as this all-powerful, all-knowing figure,
Yeah.
it would be incredibly difficult to question his behavior or his teachings.
Exactly.
They might even rationalize or justify harmful actions because they've become so reliant on him
Right.
for their sense of self and belonging.
Yeah.
That's incredibly disturbing.
And it highlights why it's so important to be aware of these dynamics and to approach spiritual seeking with a healthy dose of skepticism
right.
and critical thinking.
So how do we protect ourselves?
Yeah.
How do we know who to trust and who to be wary of?
Right.
It seems like a lot of it comes down to discernment,
Yeah.
but how do we actually develop that skill?
That's a really important question, and it's one that we are going to explore further as we continue our deep dive.
Well, I can't wait to hear more. So it seems like there's this real danger in placing these spiritual leaders on a pedestal,
Right.
assuming they're somehow above human flaws or something like that.
Yeah.
How do we avoid falling into that trap?
Well, I think one key is to remember that spiritual growth is ultimately about personal transformation. It's not about blind obedience to an external authority.
So you're saying genuine teachers, they would actually encourage you to think for yourself,
Exactly.
to question their teachings even.
They'll emphasize, the importance of inner work,
Right.
self-reflection, rather than just blindly following a set of rules or rituals.
That makes sense. But what if someone is really good, like skilled at manipulating people?
Right.
They could present themselves as this wise, compassionate teacher
Mm-hmm.
while still, exerting a lot of control.
Yeah, how do you see through that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's a good question, and there are no easy answers.
Right.
But one thing to look out for is a lack of transparency,
Oh, okay.
especially when it comes to finances.
Okay.
So if a group is secretive about how they use donations,
Right.
or if the leader seems to be benefiting personally from the followers' generosity,
Mm-hmm.
that's a major red flag.
And in the case of the Science of Identity Foundation,
Yeah.
there do seem to be some concerns about their financial transparency. Our sources mention allegations of financial irregularities
Okay.
and accusations that Butler is using donations for his own personal gain.
Yeah.
There are also questions about the group's involvement in this controversial business venture called QNet,
QN.
which is a multi-level marketing company
Yeah.
that's faced accusations of being a pyramid scheme.
Right. And while QNet has denied these allegations,
Of course.
and they do operate in many countries,
Yeah.
it's worth noting that there have been investigations and legal challenges
Right.
surrounding their business practices.
Yep.
What's particularly concerning in this context is the potential for exploitation.
Right.
If followers are being pressured to join QNet, or if they're losing money
Mm-hmm.
as a result of their involvement,
Right.
that raises serious ethical questions.
Yeah, it's blurring the lines between spiritual seeking and financial gain
Exactly.
in a way that's, I don't know, it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And speaking of uncomfortable, some of the sources mention these allegations of sexual misconduct against Butler,
Right.
which, I mean, I don't even need to say it, but it just seems particularly hypocritical.
Yeah, it's a serious accusation.
Yeah.
And it's one that should be taken very seriously.
Yeah.
If true, it would be a clear violation of the trust placed in him by his followers,
Right.
and would further call into question the integrity of his teachings.
And you've mentioned all these red flags to watch out for.
Right.
But I think it's important to say that, not all spiritual groups are harmful or manipulative.
Absolutely.
There are a ton of examples of communities out there that provide genuine support, guidance, a sense of belonging.
Yeah, for sure.
So how do we distinguish between, like, the healthy groups and the ones that might be more problematic?
Well, this is where discernment comes in.
Okay.
It's not about being suspicious of everyone or avoiding spiritual communities altogether.
Right.
It's about cultivating a wise and discerning heart, as you said earlier.
Okay.
It's about being thoughtful and observant, paying attention to how the group makes you feel.
So, like, tuning into our intuition.
Exactly.
Trusting our gut feeling.
Yeah, if something feels off,
Right.
we should pay attention to that.
And it's also important to consider whether the group encourages critical thinking
Yeah.
and open dialogue. Do they welcome questions and different perspectives, or do they demand this unquestioning obedience?
Exactly.
And that makes a lot of sense, and it's making me realize this isn't just about evaluating spiritual groups, right?
Yeah.
These same principles apply to any kind of relationship or community where there's a power dynamic at play.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a workplace, a family, even a romantic relationship.
Right.
We need to be aware of the potential for manipulation and abuse.
Absolutely, because the dynamics of power and control can be very subtle.
Yeah.
It's crucial to develop that inner compass,
Right.
that sense of self-awareness and discernment that
Yeah.
allows us to make healthy choices and protect our well-being.
And I think Kassia's story, the young woman who took her own life,
Yeah,
it's a stark reminder of how important all of this is.
it is.
It's tragic that she felt so lost and alone.
Yeah.
Makes me wonder if there was anything that could have been done to help her.
Right. You're right to bring her story back into focus.
Yeah.
It highlights the very real human costs of spiritual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of reaching out for help.
Yeah.
If we or someone we know is struggling,
Yeah.
there are resources available,
Oh,
whether it's a trusted friend or family member,
right.
a therapist, a support organization.
And I think for those of us who are fortunate enough to be in supportive, healthy, spiritual communities,
Yeah,
we need to be mindful of those who might be more vulnerable.
right.
We can create spaces where people feel safe to question, to doubt, to express their unique perspectives.
Exactly.
It's about fostering genuine connection and understanding,
Mm-hmm.
not blind faith or obedience.
Beautifully said,
Yeah.
you know. That's what true spiritual practice is all about. Cultivating compassion, understanding, and a deep respect for the dignity of all beings.
Right.
It's about creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued,
Yeah.
and where we can all support each other on our individual journeys of growth and transformation.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening.
Good.
And I feel a lot more equipped to approach spiritual seeking with, both curiosity and discernment.
It's been a pleasure exploring these complex issues with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, we hope that this conversation has empowered you to approach spiritual seeking with a critical and compassionate mind.
Yes.
Remember, the path to truth is rarely straightforward,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a journey worth taking.
As we've been talking about all these red flags and potential pitfalls,
Right.
it's got me thinking about the role of self-criticism and spiritual growth.
Okay.
Earlier we were discussing that quote from Butler,
Yeah.
where he emphasizes focusing on our imperfections
Right.
as a path to experiencing love for Krishna. Is there a healthy way to approach self-criticism?
That's a good question.
Or is it always potentially harmful?
I think it's important to distinguish between self-criticism that is rooted in self-hatred or shame
Right.
versus self-reflection that's aimed at understanding ourselves more deeply and growing as individuals.
So it's about being honest with ourselves about our shortcomings,
Right.
but without beating ourselves up or
Mhm.
losing sight of our inherent worth.
Exactly. And I think it's helpful to remember that we're all works in progress.
Right.
None of us are perfect.
Yeah,
And that's okay.
of course.
The goal isn't to become some kind of flawless spiritual being.
Right.
It's to embrace our humanity with all of its complexities
Right.
and to strive to live in alignment with our values.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes me think about those traditional practices that you mentioned earlier, like giving up material possessions,
Yeah.
avoiding pride. Are those practices inherently problematic,
Right.
or can they be beneficial if they're approached with the right mindset?
I think the key is intention. Why are we choosing to engage in these practices?
Right.
Are we doing it out of a genuine desire to simplify our lives
Mm-hmm.
and focus on what truly matters?
Yeah.
Or are we doing it to prove our spiritual superiority
Right.
or earn approval from others?
So if we're motivated by fear or a need for external validation,
Yeah,
those practices might actually be counterproductive.
absolutely. It can become a form of self-punishment
Right.
or a way to mask our deeper insecurities.
But if they're approached with a spirit of self-awareness
Hmm.
and a genuine desire for growth,
Yes.
they could be valuable tools
Right.
for cultivating humility and detachment.
Exactly.
So it seems like a lot of this just comes down to discernment,
Yeah.
being able to distinguish between teachings and practices that are genuinely helpful
Mm.
and the ones that might be harmful or manipulative.
You hit the nail on the head.
And that discernment, it's not just about analyzing the teachings, intellectually.
Right.
It also involves paying attention to how they make us feel.
Yes.
Do they leave us feeling empowered and inspired?
Mm.
Or do they make us feel anxious, guilty, ashamed?
Right.
Our intuition can be a really powerful guide,
Absolutely.
but it's important to recognize that our own experiences and biases can influence how we perceive and interpret those teachings.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to expose ourselves to a variety of perspectives
Okay.
and to engage in open and honest dialogue with others.
Right.
We can learn so much from listening to people who have different beliefs and experiences than our own.
As I think about all of the information that we've covered today,
Yeah.
I'm realizing this deep dive hasn't just been about evaluating spiritual groups.
Right.
It's also been a journey of self-discovery, a reminder to approach all areas of my life with, a more discerning and compassionate eye.
I think that's a beautiful insight.
Helps.
And it really speaks to the interconnectedness of our spiritual and personal growth. The skills we develop in one area can really be applied to all aspects of our lives.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
What are some key takeaways that you want to leave our listener with?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that you are your own best authority.
Okay.
No one else can tell you what is true for you,
Right.
what path is right for you.
Right.
Trust your intuition, ask questions,
Mm-hmm.
be willing to challenge your assumptions,
Right.
and never be afraid to seek guidance and support from those you trust.
That's such an empowering message.
Oh,
And it reminds me that spiritual seeking, it's a lifelong journey,
it is.
full of twists and turns.
For sure.
There'll be times when we feel lost or
Yeah.
confused,
Yeah.
but those are often the times when we have the most to learn.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure sharing this exploration with you.
Likewise,
And to you, dear listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
of course.
May you continue to seek truth with a curious and discerning heart.
Until next time, stay curious.